Hello, everyone. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett, and welcome to Across the Sky, our national Lee Enterprises weather podcast. Lee Enterprises has print and digital operations in 77 locations across the country, including in my home base in Richmond, Virginia. I'm here with my meteorology co-host from Across the Sky, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Matt Holliner, who serves several of our locations there from his home operation in Chicago. How is everybody doing this week? Kirsten, let's start with you in Tulsa.
Yeah, things are going good. You know, it's we're recording this, of course, in October, so we finally are just getting a little bit of rainfall and getting ramped up here too, in my household at least, for Halloween. You know, it's a big deal now that we have the little kids, and so that's been the rage here in the Lang household over the past couple of weeks. It's Halloween.
Matt, how's the Midwest, man?
Doing pretty good. I'm starting to get concerned that Halloween is being overlooked by Christmas already. I see all this talk about holiday shopping. Like, what in the world? What? We have to do Halloween first. Come on. And I always think Thanksgiving is the forgotten holiday. It's like once Halloween's over, it's like forget Thanksgiving. It's on to Christmas. I don't know. I'm very much in one holiday at a time. Let's do Halloween, then let's do Thanksgiving, and then you can do your Christmas shopping after Thanksgiving, like Black Friday. Come on, don't do holiday shopping in October.
I know you need this. Well, Prime now is doing their little sale in October, right? But usually
I just got the notification.
Yes, I got that too, Joe.
Yeah.
There'll be more sales. Calm down.
It's all hype.
But Joe, how are things otherwise at the Jersey Shore, man?
Well, I'll tell you what, October is actually my least favorite month. And it is my sister. I'm going to preface by saying it's actually my sister and my dad's birthday in October. So that is good. But October usually doesn't treat me well. So I'm waiting for my October surprise. I have had the flu with a 105 fever in October. I have lost 105. Whoa. I have lost teeth in the month of October. Superstorm Sandy hit in the month of October. I also had another medical condition I won't get into in October. So October is not friendly to Joe Martucci here. So I'm just kind of staying in a bubble for the month and hoping that I'll wake up in November 1st and be okay.
It's extra spooky for you.
Yeah. It is. Yes. Some would say it is extra spooky for me in October. And Rutgers football lost the last game. So, I mean, you know, it's just not a good month, you know. So that's what's happening here.
Joe and I had a fun little text rivalry going this past week with the Rutgers and Nebraska game. Yeah, I'm sorry, Joe. I know that didn't end in your favor.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened. Spaz. See, Kirsten this is the spooky stuff that happens in October. Wow. I just don't know. Now you can't even see me.
Well,
but anyway, yeah, we did. So Kirsten's husband and uncle, I think, are Nebraska Cornhusker supporters. Nebraska football played Rutgers on Friday night under the lights in Piscataway, and Rutgers let the football game slip away. They were up 14-0 or 13-0, and they lost 14-13. So the Lang family had quite the range of emotions that Friday night.
But it was mostly shock, Joe. I have to say, it wasn't like we were sitting here saying like, "Yes, we won." I think a lot of us were like, "Did we just win that game?" Because Nebraska is not, you know.
As I said, I'm happy for the Lang family. Rutgers football, in the meanwhile, fired their offensive coordinator. So shout out to Kirsten's husband, who said, "Is Shiano on the hot seat if they lose?" And I said no. That was a firm no. And I'll say I was maybe half right, and Kirsten's husband was half right because the offensive coordinator got fired. So someone went down, but not Greg Schiano.
Oh yes, heart of this season, heart of football season. It's tough to let those folks go in the middle of the season, but unfortunately that's the way it goes sometimes. But fall here in the thick of it, and with that also comes the fall foliage, and in most of the country anyway. We're starting to see a few leaves turning in the mountains here in Virginia, and certainly other parts of the country. It's well underway. And with that, we want to bring in our guest, Dr. Amanda Gallinat, a visiting assistant professor of environmental studies at Colby College in Maine. That's about an hour north of Portland. Now, her research highlights the local and global potential for climate-driven shifts in autumn phenology, basically the timing of the seasons and their interaction between plants and animals, especially as the climate continues to warm. And obviously that's going to have an impact on the fall foliage that we've all come to know and love. Dr. Gallinat, thank you for joining us on Across the Sky.
Thanks so much for having me.
So talk a little bit about your work before we jump into the questions. Like, what's your kind of opening salvo and, the elevator pitch when somebody says, what exactly do you do again?
Yeah, so I'm a community ecologist. So I study the interactions between plants and animals. And I'm also a climate change ecologist. And so I'm ultimately looking at how human-driven changes in our environment are affecting the timing of the seasons and interactions between organisms in the field. And a lot of that has to do with the timing of autumn. So I actually love the month of October. This is when, my all my favorite things are happening outside. The fruits are ripening, the birds are migrating, and the leaves are changing color. And so there's so much to see outside. I mean, especially here in Maine, here in sort of mid-October, we're just seeing so much autumn color. And we really do see that the effects of climate change on some of those events is that they're shifting in time. So we see some events happening later in the year and some happening earlier. It can lead to some disconnects in interactions between plants and animals too. So things like warming temperature, ripening, later bird migration means that some of those that are really important for the ecology of plants and animals are at risk with increasing sort of effects of climate change.
Yeah, and it's never one easy answer, right? I mean, I think that's the problem. So many times we want to hear, "Oh, climate change is going to do X, the end," but that's not how it really works. So let's step back a little bit. At the basic level, the colors show up in the leaves because the trees are going dormant. They stop producing chlorophyll, which is green. So every species, of course, is different, but in a background state, what are some of the conditions that generally lead to good colors and versus, bad colors as we'd like to think of them?
Yeah, so what we are observing out in the field right now is our trees sort of reabsorbing nutrients. And that reflects those autumn colors that we see. And when we see bright colors, it really reflects sort of the health of the plants. And so the conditions that really create sort of optimal, brilliant fall foliage are warm, sunny days and cold nights. That's sort of what we would expect to see the brightest, most brilliant autumn foliage in. And so our plants are tracking a few things in the autumn that reflect both their health and sort of the timing of the seasons and the effects of climate change. So plants are tracking daylight hours. So as days are shortening, they're able to sort of progress in their physiology of reabsorbing those nutrients in the fall. They're tracking temperatures. So as temperatures chill, especially those cool nighttime temperatures, as the temperatures chill, they're also able to progress further in that autumn season. But there are other things that matter too. So with those sort of warmer temperatures in the fall with climate change, we actually see plants sort of extending the autumn season. They're getting later in the year. But if daytime temperatures are too warm, and we see that coinciding with drought, that can actually cause stress for the plants and pull that autumn season earlier, where we'll see duller colors, so representing sort of poorer quality, poorer sort of physiological conditions for the plants, and we see duller colors as a result. So what we ideally want to see is sort of plenty of moisture in the soil. We want to see cool nights, warm days, and that's going to give us those bright yellows and oranges and reds. Whereas if we see drought, we're more likely to have plants changing to sort of dull yellows and browns earlier in the season.
Is there any evidence that if the ground is too moist, I mean, not necessarily that it's flooded, but it's been a lot wetter than normal in the preceding, let's say, 1 to 2 months ahead of the classical beginning of when the leaves turn, that plays an impact as well? Or is it more just dry weather?
Generally, we are more concerned about the impacts of drought on plants than we are on flooding in terms of their autumn phenology. We might see sort of an extension of the season, so more of those sort of cool, wet delays in the timing of color change following a lot of precipitation. But yeah, generally, we're more concerned about the physiological impacts of drought on the timing of that autumn color change.
It's Joe here, and actually you bring up a great segue into my question, which is drought in full foliage here. I, at least for the Press of Atlantic City, just wrapped up a piece about the drought we've been having in fall foliage across the area. In short, people have told me from the Forest Service that foliage has been or will be and has been earlier, as well as more muted with colors here. Just want your take on that. And then in addition, what happens to the leaves during drought? And as kind of a side note, does it matter when, is it worse to have a drought at one point of the growing season than others?
There is, I will say, a lot we still don't know about what drives senescence for different species. So not only is phenology sort of already complicated by the sort of different impacts of those different drivers that I mentioned on different species. So they're all sort of responding to different cues or to those cues differently. But also, we have now the complication of these extreme events and changes in our environment with climate change that are differentially impacting different species. And so we know that there are some species that are more likely to sort of succumb to the risk of drought in terms of their health and their ability to draw back those nutrients in efficient ways in the fall. So for instance, we might see maples being more sensitive to drought than we do oaks. And one of the issues with that for fall foliage is that those maples are some of the plants that are producing our most brilliant foliage in the fall compared to oaks that are a little bit more muted. And so, yes, we see drought causing more dull, muted colors. And we also see that occurring in plants that produce some of our brightest colors. Can you remind me what your first question was?
Oh, no. It was more just confirming what I know the New Jersey Forest Service has told me, in the sense that drought has makes foliage earlier and more muted, which I think you just said.
Yeah, you asked what was happening in the leaves, I think.
Yeah. What's happening? Yeah, correct. What happens to the leaves during drought in terms of, bringing us not the best results when it comes to foliage?
Yeah, so I think to answer that question, it's important to discuss sort of what is actually happening in a leaf that gives us those bright colors. And so, Sean, you mentioned that we have the chlorophyll being drawn back. So that chlorophyll is the green pigment in the leaves, and it's reflecting green back at us. So we're seeing reflected back the colors that are not being absorbed by a particular pigment in the plant. So we all know chlorophyll from our high school biology class, right? Chlorophyll is really responsible for ramping up that photosynthesis during the growing season. We see those bright greens. And then when the plant in the fall is pulling that chlorophyll back, we actually start to see some of the underlying pigments that are also in the leaf. So for instance, carotenoids are the pigments that are reflecting back those yellow and orange colors. And because the green has been pulled back, we're actually able to see those underlying carotenoids. The plants are also producing pigments in the fall. So that red color is not just revealed, but it's actually produced by the plant. And that's a pigment called anthocyanin. And anthocyanin is reflecting back red pigment or red light. And so we know that red light is sort of the most intense light. And that is what the plants are doing. They're creating this sort of sunscreen for their leaves. And so in one of those autumns where we have really bright sunny days and cold nights where we get that brilliant color out in the field, what we're seeing is that sunscreen and those underlying pigments because the plant has efficiently pulled back its chlorophyll. So when we have a drought, the plant is it's going to rush to pull back what chlorophyll it can. The leaves are going to sort of turn maybe dull yellows, and they'll turn brown because we just don't have the water to continue to sort of to keep that plant healthy. And they're just going to go into that sort of dormant season. So drop those leaves. And so that's sort of what we're seeing is the absence of that normal physiological process when we have a plant undergoing drought. And as a result, it's not going to pull those nutrients back as efficiently. And so we might see impacts in the following years of sort of fewer nutrients going into excess biomass production, excess leaf production in the following years, and lower photosynthesis as a result.
You just as a follow-up, and I was going to ask this later, but you kind of alluded to this. Does drought during the foliage season have any impact on the leaves, sprouting up in the spring?
Yeah, so that is an area where we really need more research, is to understand sort of the lag effects of what happens in the fall on the following spring. And we know that some plants are more vulnerable than others. So young plants, for instance, might have fewer resources to recover and bounce back from nutrient loss in the fall. But some of those older trees that we have, they can handle a year or two, of physiological knockback. But when we start to see more and more frequency of those events, that's when those plants might be in trouble. And we really don't have a lot of information on how the nutrient loss in one year might impact the amount or health of foliage in the following year. So those lag effects are something we really want to know more about.
Yeah, and I imagine that's going to be real important out in the West, particularly where you have year after year of drought. I'm sure that's going to end up having an impact. And also that brings me to my question, because I think, in some places of the country, I know growing up in Texas, the fall colors, that's not what Texas is known for. And maybe parts of the West, the fall colors aren't quite what they used to be. So I imagine people who want to see the best fall colors are more likely to travel now. And particularly the place that's probably most famous for the fall colors, where you are in New England. And I've been to New England in the fall, and it is absolutely worth the trip. If you've never made a trip to New England in the fall, it is absolutely worth it, because the colors there are spectacular. And, so I want to know, as a resident in New England, you're in Maine, when would you recommend folks to come and visit? If they're planning a trip, what would you recommend is the best time? Now, of course, we've just talked about all the variations that can occur, but what would you say on average is the best time? If someone was several months out planning a trip to New England to come check out the fall colors, when would you recommend they come?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really couldn't be luckier than being sort of a professional leaf peeper living in New England. So this time of year, actually right now, we are experiencing peak fall colors in Maine. And so here we are sort of mid-October, and that's pretty standard for Maine. And then the peak of fall foliage is really going to spread from sort of the north of New England down to the south, as those plants are tracking the changing day length and the cooling temperatures. And so I would say anytime sort of early October to sort of mid-November is a time when you're likely to see some really good autumn colors. By mid-November, you might be a little bit on the late end, and especially in the case of sort of years where we are seeing some drought having impacts, particularly in southern New England and the northern sort of northeast in sort of the Hudson Valley area. I would say aiming for sort of mid to late October is really when you're going to see some brilliant autumn colors.
So Amanda, one thing that we have been dealing with here in Tulsa is leaf scorching. And so that's been, one of those things that it's kind of been, I was told may or may not, be affecting our color. We don't get quite the color you get, of course, in Maine, but I was wondering if you could maybe explain leaf scorching and then how that might be, or maybe just if you know whether or not that might be impacting our color here.
So leaf scorching, I'm curious, is that the result of sort of high sunlight or drought? I'm not sure I know that term, actually.
Oh, I apologize. So leaf scorching is really more of a drought thing. And what has happened here in Oklahoma, specifically, I guess, is that we're starting to see some of these trees get leaves where they almost look like they're dying and from the outside in. And then it's like one little branch looks like it's turning and then they drop. And so I was told that it does have to do, with a drought kind of situation. But I wasn't sure whether or not that may or may not impact, our color here, as far south as Tulsa.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I think we have some of the same tree species in common, and really anywhere that we see drought, we may expect to see some of these physiological impacts on leaves. And so it sounds like you are observing what we're chatting about here with the impacts of drought. that is sort of most likely to affect the sort of outermost branches of the plant. First, it's sort of harder to move water out to those farthest branches, and they're most likely to experience high sort of sun incidence. And so that might be sort of the first indication that your plants are experiencing the physiological impacts of drought. Thanks for teaching me that term.
Yeah, sometimes the terminology is different in different parts of the country, for sure. We all have our little vernacular in certain parts of the country. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more with Amanda Gallinat on the Across the Sky podcast. And we're back on the Across the Sky podcast with Dr. Amanda Gallinat at Colby College in Maine, talking about fall foliage. In the first part, we talked about how the colors show up, the chlorophyll kind of retreating, and we see those pigments and colors show up. But what makes the leaves physically fall from the trees? I mean, what's going on there that suddenly, now they just drop?
Yeah, so we actually refer to the whole process as autumn leaf senescence, and that includes both color change and leaf fall. And so as the plants are pulling back that chlorophyll, reabsorbing nutrients, they're also forming a layer, a barrier between the plant and the leaf, and we call that the abscission layer. And it really is a barrier that allows the leaf to fall off the plant. And so that's another part of the process that is reflecting sort of chilling temperatures and shorter day lengths. And so as the process progresses, they pull the chlorophyll back, they form that layer, and then we need wind essentially to knock those leaves off. And so if you have a year that's particularly warm and not especially windy, you might see brown leaves staying on the tree for a really long time.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. There will be these little chunks where I see even into January here in the middle Atlantic. I'm like, this little area where the brown leaves are still just hanging on well into the winter. And I always wonder, why is that little bit hanging on? Does it have to do with the wind? Is there something else going on? Even though the trees, for the most part, are bare, but you still these little areas where there are just these quasi dead leaves hanging on.
Yeah, so it just has not quite finished that senescence process.
So and maybe you're going to blow my mind here as someone who I think has only been south once during the winter. So are you saying that there are trees that could stay just brown and hanging on the trees all the way until the leaves come back in the spring?
So, I mean, I've certainly seen it at that point. It's not really performing a function for the plant. And so it might just be that it takes until sort of spring weather activity for those plants for the leaves to finally fall off. But yeah, I mean, I've seen sort of in late spring, sometimes there are plants that still have brown leaves on them, just hanging on, or sometimes we'll see fruits that haven't been consumed from the previous year still on the plant. And so, you can see sort of the lasting impacts of the previous fall on the plants in the spring sometimes.
I tell you what, though, I mean, in Maine, have you seen that in Maine? I feel like I don't see that in New Jersey. I feel like that might just be the only times I've seen those is when I've been in the South. I've never seen that in New Jersey, or at least I've never seen it. I've never paid attention to it in New Jersey.
Yeah, it's not really widespread. It's something that might occur in sort of pockets of calm in the woods. We'll see sort of understory plants that just haven't experienced the kind of wind that it takes to knock those sort of dead leaves off of the plant.
Gotcha.
It happens eventually.
And obviously we discussed all the ways that weather impacts, the quality of the fall foliage, whether it's the drought or the temperatures. And so there's obviously going to be some seasonal variability, but I'm wondering, if folks are trying to, they have some trees in their backyard and they want to try and get the best colors possible. Is there anything that people can do to enhance their colors? Is there any fertilizers that can be used, watering techniques that can be used if you're trying to get the best colors possible, considering all the different influences and the weather influences? Is there anything that people can do to try and enhance that color? Anything that people can do to try and combat what the weather is doing?
There's not much you need to do to support a tree in undergoing senescence. I would say one thing you can do is actually monitor it. So to get a better sense of whether you are seeing changes from year to year, I know you all have talked in the past with the National Phenology Network Director, Teresa Crimmins. The NPN also collects observations on autumn leaf senescence. And so one thing you can do is sort of tend to your tree. You can go out and make observations using the Nature's Notebook app through the NPN. And so actually see whether your tree is changing its senescence from year to year. Certainly in a drought year, you might water that plant in order to see more brilliant colors, but in a drought year, you probably don't want to be putting water into that plant. So I would say, the best thing to do is sort of to sit back and watch and keep notes on your plants. And if you start to see really strong physiological impacts, it might be, that your plant is not well suited for the area if it's experiencing a lot of impacts of the local weather. For instance, if it's sort of an ornamental plant, it might be not the best fit for the area.
And Amanda, this answer to this question might vary depending, of course, on what part of the country you're in. But you were talking about how the overnight lows will also start to affect, the foliage. Is there kind of an average overnight temperature that you look for? Or again, I'm sure it ranges, but is there kind of an average overnight low temp that you look for that?
Not exactly. We know that plants are using those sort of low temperatures, that's what allows them to sort of accumulate chilling. So to keep track of how close to the winter we might be getting. And that low temperature is going to vary. So the threshold below which it starts to impact them physiologically is going to vary by species. And so there isn't one temperature that we look for, but we can sort of look at the average of this year compared to, say, the last 30 years to say, do we expect this to be a particularly late year if it's a warmer year than usual, or is it sort of in line with average low temperatures? And we're generally looking at those temperatures in sort of September, October. So the temperatures leading up to the season. Though I'll say that drought throughout the year can really affect when senescence happens. So including sort of drought in the summertime. By the autumn, if we start to get a lot of rain in October, it often won't be sort of soon enough for the plants to be sort of recovered in their autumn season.
Just chime in. That's exactly what happened here in New Jersey. We got a load of rain in October, but it is not doing anything for us.
Oh, yeah. It was just a little too late, huh?
A little too late, but we'll take the rain.
Yeah, and expanding on that a little bit with regarding the temperatures, the precipitation, circling this back to the beginning and thinking about the warming climate, there's still, I imagine, a lot of work to be done in understanding the results of climate change on certain tree species and what that will portend for the colors. Is there any broader idea? I mean, is it fair to say to the first approximation that the colors will tend to be not as bright and they will show up a little later in the year? Or do you think that's just not fair to say yet?
I think that is sort of what we are expecting, is that that the autumn colors will be generally a little bit later in the year. We've seen delays of up to a week over the last 70 years or so, particularly up here in New England. And we do expect to see some dulling of the colors over time. Whether that will play out in the magnitude that we're expecting is really unclear. We were projecting much duller colors in sort of the Boston area this year. We were also expecting later foliage in Maine, where we haven't had as extreme drought, and it's a warmer year. And here we are mid-October, and we are seeing peak. And so it's not sort of exactly where we thought it would be this year based on those differences in the environment. It is really complex. It's a complicated season. We know it's more complicated than spring. So in a warm spring, we know that leaf out is going to happen earlier. In the autumn, it's so complicated. we are still learning the differences among species. We're still learning the differences among the cues that plants use to change color and drop their leaves. And it's further complicated by the changes in the environment that we're seeing. And so there's a lot of work to be done in autumn.
Are there any tree species? I mean, obviously there's a lot of tree species, but in terms of trying to classify these for a lot of the areas eastward from the Front Range of the Rockies, when we think about the Appalachians in particular, whether it's, from northern Alabama all the way up to Maine, are there 2 or 3 classical species that people should look for, that tend to produce the best colors?
I mean, the first one that comes to mind is red maple. Red maple is sort of producing that anthocyanin, that sunscreen. And actually it does in the spring too. We see red maple, the young leaves are red and the senescing leaves are red. And so it's producing that sunscreen during a vulnerable time for the leaves when it's pulling back all those nutrients. And so red maples are going to produce incredible color. And I'll say one of the things that we notice is that red maple, compared to some of its close relatives that evolved in different contexts. So for instance, Norway maple, which is a common street tree across the eastern United States and beyond, is it doesn't produce that anthocyanin. And that's in part because we know that the solar irradiation, so the amount of sunlight that our trees here are the context that they evolved in, requires that sunscreen compared to plants in Europe that are experiencing sort of lower sunlight incidence. So red maple, it's going to produce that bright red color. Things like hickories will produce sort of bright yellow colors. I always like to look out for hickories. Aspens. I mean, I just think the aspens in the West are so beautiful. People talk about the autumn color change in New England. And certainly we have a great diversity of color here, of reds and oranges and yellows, and it's spectacular. But I just think those aspens, when you get a really beautiful senescence season in the West, it's just gorgeous.
Hey, Amanda, I was just going to ask here, if we were to look at the United States as a whole, could you briefly, we don't have to go through every single location, but when does fall foliage peak in let's say Alaska and then take us all the way down south, just to give people a timeline of when to expect it?
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure that I know the answer to that, but I would say that there are some resources that people can use to find that information. So there is a fall foliage map prediction from I believe it's from the Smoky Mountains.
I think it's greatsmokymountains.com.
Thank you, greatsmokymountains.com. They've produced a fall foliage map, and it uses some of those same cues that we talked about. So things like daylight hours, temperature, soil moisture, all of those sort of predictions to tell us when we might expect to see peak fall foliage across the country.
Gotcha. Sorry, I didn't mean to stump you on that one. But you can go check out greatsmokymountains.com. No, because I always think in Maine, for example, I mean, it's mid-October now. I mean, what you're seeing is different than what I'm seeing down the coast, and what's different what Sean's seeing even a little further south. So
yeah, absolutely. I will say it's all going to happen over the course of a month or so. And so when we're seeing sort of the coldest places start in sort of late September, early October, and then that's going to progress all the way to sort of mid to late November, some sort of early December in sort of far south.
Yeah, everybody gets a little bit different. That's the great thing. You do the road trips, whether you're in New England, the Middle Atlantic, or in the Western United States. There's so many wonderful things to see nationwide. Going to wrap things up for time here. Amanda, I want to say thank you so much for joining us, because there is so much information to digest. It is such a wide variety of different foliage across the country. So thank you for bringing your expertise to us. Where can people go online to find out more about the work that you're doing there in Maine?
Oh, sure. Well, so can follow me on Twitter at Amanda Gallinat and on my website at amandagallinat.com.
Fabulous. Terrific. Thank you again. We appreciate you spending some time with us today. And stay with us, everybody. We'll be back with some closing thoughts here on Across the Sky.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your Astronomy Outlook.
3 weeks ago, NASA flew the car-sized DART spacecraft into the 5-story tall moonlet Dimorphos at about 14,000 miles an hour. After 2 weeks of observation from a network of ground-based telescopes back here on Earth, Dimorphos' orbital period, from the time it takes to make one lap around parent asteroid Didymos, showed that using a kinetic impactor can be used as a planetary defense technique. That orbital period went from 11 hours and 55 minutes to 11 hours and 23 minutes, a reduction of about 5%. That may not sound like much, but it could be a game changer according to Lori Glaze, director of NASA's Planetary Science Division. What this tells us is that should a space rock threaten Earth, we've got a technology in our back pocket that might help. Even a small change like this can have a big impact on the trajectory of an object. Thankfully, the technology isn't needed right now. According to NASA's Center for Near-Earth Object Studies, the riskiest object found to date only has a 1 in 83 chance of impacting Earth, and not till 2075 at the earliest. But the value DART is providing here lies in the name of that 1 in 83 object, 2022 NX1. It was just discovered in July of this year, and that's where the true risk lies. We're discovering more near-Earth objects each year, so being ready is a pretty good thing. Elsewhere in the sky, if you missed using the moon to help spot Mars last week, the constellation Taurus is here to help this week. Look east after around 10 p.m. Mars will be nestled between the tips of the horns of Taurus the Bull. Also look for the slightly orange stars Aldebaran and Betelgeuse. The trio will form an equilateral triangle with reddish Mars. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
And thanks, Tony. Always appreciate to understand what's going on up there beyond the atmosphere. But again, back here on the ground, for us in Virginia, we're just about ready to get into the core of the fall foliage season. We've already seen some color up in the Blue Ridge Mountains and those locations. But I think the great thing about having her on is to understand a little bit better, or what are the processes that go into making good color versus kind of color. And it is complicated. We'd love to just say it's X or Y, but there are a lot of things that really need to kind of fall into place.
Yeah, especially with so many places in drought in the country, we're seeing a little bit of a different kind of foliage. So she was able to talk about that. And great question on the climate change angle too, Sean. What we're going to see. She said possibly some more muted colors. I don't, there's still a little more research to go, but evidence points towards more muted foliage. But, foliage is still nice no matter how muted it is. But it was good to have her on.
Yeah, the trees are not going to stop turning. I mean, let's get
yes,
that out
correct.
there now.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe the trees will evolve too. It's just like with forecasting weather, it's difficult to forecast what the trees are going to do. Some of them are, you expect them to turn at a certain point, but they are not doing that. Even with drought, they're going against the adverse conditions towards them. So maybe there's an evolution process already underway that the trees are adapting to the changes in the climate, and will find a way. As they say, life finds a way. So maybe that's what is ongoing. So it'll be interesting. It's just like every aspect when it comes to science, it'll be interesting to continue to see how this evolves and how the research and the science evolves when it comes to fall foliage.
Yeah, another thing that seems to be at least kind of I'll say air quotes, hot topic in Tulsa sometimes is, talking about or trying to predict when we may see that peak, week of leaves changing colors. So I'm sure all of those, it was just interesting listening to her talk about how there's so many different ways to for that to all happen. So every year I feel like we talk about, oh, is it going to be, the middle or end of October that we're going to be seeing our peak color? And like I mentioned earlier, the peak color here in Tulsa is not quite the same as the peak color up towards the north, but it's still pretty. It's still very pretty, especially considering both Matt and myself grew up in San Antonio and there was nothing. It was brown. It was brown and then sometimes green if you had like a good year, but mainly brown.
Yeah, well, right now we've got a massive acorn drop because we've got a lot of oaks. I mean, it's almost like there's hail falling on the roof every once in a while because there's still a lot of green out there, but you can see the changes here in Central Virginia. But man, the acorns are just all over the place right now.
That makes for fun cleanup.
Oh, yeah.
Need some deer to come eat those acorns.
What's that, Matt?
Need some deer to come eat the acorns.
Yeah. You do. Are there deer in San Antonio?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Hollywood Park. That's a famous neighborhood where it's just covered in deer. Too many.
We lived there. My family lived there, and we had to fight the deer and in our vegetation, our gardens. They would come and eat our gardens. My dad would put barbed wire up.
Oh yeah. We see all that around here as well. People they put the wire around the tomato garden, the tomato plants, and all that stuff here. But yeah. All right. With that, I think we'll wrap it up. Fall foliage, always a good time to talk about that. And of course, before we toss to the close here, Joe, tell everybody what we've got percolating for next week. Our old buddy there from Mount Holly.
Yeah, our old buddy, Gary Zakowski. He is a retired meteorologist in charge of the National Weather Service office in Mount Holly, New Jersey. That is in Burlington County, New Jersey. Shout out Burlington County. That covers the Philadelphia area, most of New Jersey. And we're with him to talk about Sandy. Superstorm Sandy was 10 years ago this month on October 29th. And he gained a lot of notoriety during Sandy for his personal plea to residents to evacuate, and has really, in many ways, helped to shape the way we communicate between the National Weather Service and the public via social media. So it's good to have him on. We'll have him on. That's going to be our October 24th episode of the Across the Sky podcast, which is also my sister's 30th birthday.
How about that? Yeah, I love Gary. It'll be exciting to have him on. So with that, we'll close it up for this week. So for Joe Martucci here in Atlantic City, Matt Holland in Chicago, and Kirsten Lang at Tulsa World, I'm Sean Sublett from Richmond, Virginia, and the Richmond Times-Dispatch for Lee Enterprises. Thank you for joining us on the Across the Sky podcast, and we will talk with you next week.